Chapter 11 of Hannibal by George Philip Baker. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Publius Scipio and the Struggle in Africa. 1. The landing of Scipio was a portent which troubled Carthage. His first operations sent a stream of refugees to the great city, where the most frantic efforts were being made to cope with the emergency. He was almost immediately joined by Massinissa. Massinissa, with a ragged regiment of some 200 desert riders, was all that survived from the schemes which Scipio had entertained in Spain of gaining over the Numidians. But Massinissa was a host in himself, a most redoubtable sheik, and one of those strange meridionals, always so interesting to Europeans, who combine the fiercest passions with the coldest intelligence, and whose force of character and knowledge of horses, horsemen, and the tactics of the desert rise to the level of genius. Publius could safely have relinquished all the other alliances in Africa for the sake of Massinissa. The sheik had been on the run since he parted with Publius in Spain, but was none the worse for the experience. He had a torrential romance to unfold. He had been promised the hand of Sophonisba, the daughter of Hannibal Gisconides, one of those passionate beauties over whose charms strong men, at any rate in Africa, flew at each other's throats. In order to undo the diplomacy of Publius, Hasdrubal, without consulting his prospective son-in-law, had bestowed the peerless beauty upon Syphax. The love-intoxicated Syphax had thereupon sworn oaths of eternal fidelity to his charmer's country, as Publius knew, and Massinissa accordingly had flown at his throat. There was a great deal more to the tale. A long story involving the kinsmen to several unrememberable degrees on each side of the sheik's family, their claims and counterclaims. Hasdrubal's attempt to assassinate Massinissa. Long rides, great battles, hair's breadth escapes, passion, murder, and sudden death, none of which the modern reader could be expected to tolerate except in their appropriate medium, the pictures. And so here was Massinissa with 200 men of the desert and what he stood up in. Publius, welcoming him in his comparatively cold European way, may have discerned, as a student of character, that he stood up in an astonishing amount of ardor, ability, and ruthless resolution. Massinissa flung himself into the fray with relish. A cavalry corps, 4,000 strong, had left Carthage to reconnoiter in force. Publius wanted it, and Massinissa proceeded to get it for him. The desert riders were soon worrying and skirmishing on its flanks, drawing it on until the Roman cavalry, waiting behind some high ground, could, at a suitable moment, descend upon it. 3/4 of the Carthaginian corps were killed or captured in the hard-ridden rout. The sheik had declared himself. 2. After his first preliminary sweep of the country, Publius settled down to invest Utica as the best base he could acquire. His siege operations were interrupted by the approach of the main Carthaginian forces. Hannibal Gisconides, with over 30,000 men, had waited until he was joined by Syphax with a vast host of Numidians and Mauritanians. Maintaining his blockading lines, Publius retired to the long, narrow headland east of Utica and dug in. Hasdrubal and Syphax took positions whence they could watch him. The situation of Publius was, to all appearance, hopeless. Interest, however, rather rose than fell in Rome. Supplies were poured in upon him. The Senate dispatched drafts to Sicily to set him free from responsibility for the defense of the island. The interest of the sporting public at home, though prolonged, was destined to be rewarded. Publius spent most of the winter in feeling for his opening. He was particularly willing to discuss terms of peace with Syphax, who, a little uneasy in his conscience concerning the relation in which he stood to both parties, was flattered to find himself in the position of arbitrator between two great powers. Massinissa sat shrouded patiently in the background until he should be needed. The opinion of Syphax was that both parties should evacuate one another's territory. This proposition was discussed at great length, and envoys were continually passing to and fro. Finally, Scipio demanded that the Carthaginians should give a definite undertaking. After inquiry, Syphax reported that Hasdrubal would accept the terms discussed. Publius was thereupon sorry that, although he himself was in favor of peace, his advisers objected to the details. The negotiations were, with regret, broken off, much to the annoyance of Syphax, whose importance suddenly disappeared, and matters reverted to the state of war. The lamentable fire which broke out in the camp of Syphax that night caused considerable alarm, which increased when those who rushed out to extinguish it did not return again, and rose to panic when the flames spread rapidly among the reed-built huts and involved the whole camp in one disastrous conflagration. Hasdrubal's camp was roused. Its commander awoke to find that the Carthaginian camp also was burning. Hasdrubal did not take long to make up his mind. Seeing that the fires were obviously incendiary, and that there was not the remotest hope of stemming them, he gathered his gear and forced his way to safety. Syphax did the same. When the sun rose over ancient Utica, Massinissa's riders were resolutely scattering the scattered fugitives yet more widely, and no Carthaginian fighting force was left intact. Massinissa must have felt great pleasure at this sudden and complete change of role from pursued into pursuer. Publius had struck with devastating effect. His plans had been carefully laid, with the continual advice and criticism of the sheik. And this had been the reason for those artfully disguised intelligence officers who, tricked out as servants and attendants, had daily chewed straws about the Carthaginian camp in the wake of the peace envoys. 3. This unexpected reversal of the situation was a still more profound shock to Carthage. Scipio, far from being isolated at Utica, was now master of the open. There was division of opinion in the Carthaginian council, and some lack of definite views concerning the future. It was proposed to call upon Hannibal for help and to reopen peace negotiations. Stronger counsels finally prevailed. Hasdrubal was authorized to gather and reorganize the fugitives, while touch was reestablished with Syphax. The arrival of a corps of Celtiberian mercenaries helped to restore confidence. Within a month, a fresh army was ready for the field. It dug in at the Great Plains and waited. Publius, now that he had elbow room, was ready. His men were in high fettle. He advanced immediately from Utica, intending to strike before the new Carthaginian army could be welded into an adequate fighting force. After 2 days of light trial fighting, Hasdrubal accepted a general engagement. It was the first pitched battle fought by Scipio in Africa. He used it to test a tactical method, a variation of Hannibal's theme at Cannae. The cavalry onslaught of the Numidian and Italian horse swept the Carthaginian wings away. The Spanish infantry, enveloped by new wings wheeled out from the rear lines of the Roman center, fell fighting to the last. Hasdrubal retreated to Carthage. Scipio, now in control of the whole country, detached Laelius and Massinissa to follow Syphax into Numidia. By this second battle, the whole situation was transformed. It was Carthage now who was fighting at bay. The Carthaginian council had a very serious state of affairs to deal with. Various suggestions were put forward. A naval stroke at the Roman fleet was proposed. Preparations for a siege. Peace negotiations. And again, a call to Hannibal. It was peculiarly characteristic that the council finally settled upon the grand expedient of adopting all these plans. It proposed to run hard with the hare and to pursue indomitably with the hounds, and it took up the task with energy. The subcommittees entrusted with the several policies parted at the door of the council chamber. 4. The naval stroke was the first to eventuate. Publius, advancing upon Tunis, whence Carthage was clearly visible, beheld the fleet at sea. He doubled back to Utica as fast as he could go, and he got there first. When the Carthaginian fleet, after some hesitation, put into Utica, it was to find the Roman warships, which were totally unprepared for an action, ensconced behind a floating rampart of transports, lashed one to another. The Carthaginians managed to cut away a number of these and towed off 6, a poor result of what was to have been a decisive blow at the Roman communications. No better, however, could be done. Laelius and the sheik had meanwhile made contact with Syphax. The new Numidian levies, in spite of the heroic efforts of Syphax, broke before the Roman infantry, and Syphax, leading a forlorn hope to retrieve the day, was captured. Massinissa lost no time in riding for Cirta and the fair charmer. It was an affecting interview. Sophonisba, in all her tender femininity, knelt at the feet of the conquering hero and implored with tears that she might fall into the hands of a fellow African, not into the hands of Rome. Massinissa, exalted to the skies, gave the lovely suppliant his royal right hand. He welcomed her touching assurances that she had been coerced into marriage with the hated Syphax. He married her that day. He was in a hurry, and he had reason to be. Laelius, arriving hotfoot, was furious to find the ceremony over. He claimed Sophonisba as a Roman prisoner. Considering the character and temperament of Massinissa, the argument which ensued was probably a warm one. It terminated in a compromise. The matter was to be referred to Publius for arbitration. Massinissa, in the meantime, was to stick to business. He may have reflected that anyhow he had had his fling. A Numidian in love can live fast. Syphax, foaming with impotent rage, was haled away to Utica, Son's kingdom, Son's crown, and torn from Sophonisba. Syphax made the fullest use of the advantage that he was the first to arrive in Utica. To the stern inquiries of Publius how it came about that he had broken faith with the Romans and had even dared to pit his puny strength against Rome, Syphax made a full confession. It was the madness of love. It was the hymeneal torch, said Syphax, with meridional imagery, that had set his house on fire. Sophonisba had been the enchantress who intoxicated him to his downfall. But, said the virtuous Syphax, he rejoiced in his desolation to see his loathed rival caught in the same toils. Massinissa was young and innocent. He would soon fall captive to the songs of that Carthaginian siren. The coloring, as laid on by Syphax, was undoubtedly luxuriant. But Publius could believe anything of a Numidian in love, and he felt it extremely probable that the prophecy of Syphax was, in broad outline, true. The report made upon his return by Laelius served to confirm his doubts. Publius, therefore, had a private conversation with Massinissa. What Publius is alleged to have said to the sheik is quite in keeping with his repute as a tactician. Massinissa kept his emotions and his intelligence in very distinct and separate compartments of his mind. He cooled with surprising rapidity when Publius lightly touched upon the danger of mixing up sentiment with business. Sophonisba was a Roman prisoner and must go to Rome at the discretion of the Roman government. It would be a pity, thought Publius, for Massinissa to throw away the fruits of all that he had done for such a disproportionate reason as Sophonisba. The sheik saw the point more quickly than he might have done if he had not enjoyed that brief intensive honeymoon. He wept, but it was only his way of readjusting his nervous tension. Amid a grand dramatic finale, the episode of Sophonisba closed. The sheik rode on ahead to Cirta, bearing with him the hemlock cup. He told her all, left her to choose whether to die his wife or to go into Roman captivity, and rode away again. His sense of the dramatic did not suggest to him that the tableau would be improved if he died with her. Sophonisba drank, and the curtain fell slowly upon Massinissa, pointing out to the Roman officers the body of the African Helen. Publius gently reproved him for painting the lily, but since this tropical exuberance seemed native to Africa, he indulged in a little himself. At a solemn assembly of the army, he publicly acknowledged Massinissa as king of the Numidians, and invested him with a golden crown, an ivory scepter, a curule chair, and an embroidered robe and tunic. The sheik cheered up immensely over these significant gifts. Passionate beauties were much more easily acquired in Numidia than curule chairs. 5. But before the curtain had been rung down upon the romantic tragedy of Sophonisba, the Carthaginian peace envoys arrived, and the comedy began. They bowed to the very earth before Publius, with florid protestations and humble confession and contrition. The peace terms which Publius cast at them ought normally to have thrown Carthaginians into a state of hysteria. The amicable humility with which the deputation took them to its bosom was itself suspicious. It prepared to execute them and to go to Rome to receive the official ratification. The execution of the terms involved, of course, two very interesting measures: the recall of Mago and of Hannibal. Hannibal was lying quiet in Bruttium. Mago's attempt to fight his way south from Cisalpine Gaul was, however, active. A hard-fought battle forced him, wounded, to fall back again into Liguria. On receiving the dispatch from Carthage, he re-embarked his Spanish and Ligurian troops for home. Luck was adverse. He died of his wounds while passing Sardinia, and a storm dispersed his transports. Mago could be ruled off the account. So perished the second of the sons of Hamilcar Barca. Hannibal was left. He gnashed his teeth to receive the unwelcome summons, and a little of the volcanic temper of the Semite was visible beneath his impassive mask. It was necessary to go. Publius had shifted the center of the war to Africa. But although Hannibal understood well, and may himself have originated the plan by which he was withdrawn, under cover of the peace negotiations to face Publius for a final contest, still it was bitter to him to leave his hopes and plans in Italy unfulfilled. The war should have been decided there. The war would have been decided there if Carthaginians could only have understood that all their efforts should be concentrated upon Italy. He set about his preparations. Some confusion and disorder naturally marked his departure. He detached for garrison duty the troops with which he intended to cover the embarkation of the picked troops he designated for Africa. Those left behind did not in all cases take their situation philosophically, and needed to be persuaded by a little suitable violence. As the ships went out, Hannibal looked steadily back at the receding Italian shores. A very great tale had come to a disappointing end. The enthusiasm in Rome was not universal. Some senators considered it a disgrace to Rome that Hannibal should sail safely away from Italy, and they feared for Scipio. Fabius expressed the gloomy view that the state's last and hardest trial was at hand. The majority were but too thankful to see the last of Hannibal on any terms, and the Senate voted 5 days' thanksgiving to the divine powers. Laelius had accompanied Syphax to Rome. During his visit, the services of Massinissa were suitably acknowledged, and as an extraordinary compliment, the consular regalia were voted to the sheik, who had thus made a very profitable exchange for Sophonisba. Laelius had left again, when the arrival of the peace envoys from Carthage caused his recall by the Senate. His presence was desired. The suspicions of the Senate, aroused by the departure of Hannibal, were thoroughly awakened by the conduct of the peace envoys, who did not create quite the impression they designed. The principle asserted by the envoys was that Carthage had not been responsible for the war. The whole blame rested upon Hannibal, and as between two governments the peace which closed the First Punic War might be regarded as unbroken. The Senate quite declined to take this point of view. But the really serious question was, did the Carthaginian government expect it? For combining the recall of Hannibal with the presentation of such a totally unacceptable basis of negotiation, the Carthaginian government might so maneuver the situation as to concentrate its scattered armies against Scipio in Africa, and then throw upon the Romans the onus of rejecting the peace. On the other hand, Scipio had certainly passed on the terms to the Senate. Did this mean that he was willing to allow the maneuver? It was a conceivable theory that Publius, a self-confident man, was actually desirous of seeing the Carthaginian armies concentrated in front of him. The debate in the Senate showed a general unanimity in these views, but some difference respecting the precise course to be adopted. Some were for adjourning the discussion, some for referring to Scipio, some for the instant denunciation of the armistice. This was the subject on which the Senate desired to question Laelius. The latter was able to throw some light upon the obscurity. He thought that Publius had only contemplated the withdrawal of the Carthaginian armies from Italy after the settlement. If this were so, the apprehensions of Fabius had not been without ground. Publius had allowed himself to be outwitted by astute Phoenician diplomatists. Fabius was a very old man. His death at this juncture is quite likely to have been due to worry over the dangers of the situation. The consul Scipio was hurrying into Sicily with the intention of following Hannibal to Africa, while Rome was solemnly subscribing to the funeral costs of the man who had first checked and held Hannibal in Italy. The Senate at once obtained the nomination of a dictator, the only magistrate who had authority to recall a consul. Any attempt to interfere with Publius, besides embarrassing his military operations, might create a serious schism in the state. At the same time, it is clear that the Senate's confidence in Publius, never very strong, had received a shock. The Senate as a body had to restrain its individual members from any hasty action. The question was referred to the Assembly. How prudent the Senate was in this matter could be seen in the overwhelming vote by which Publius was returned as commander in Africa. A commission was dispatched to Africa to explain to Scipio the Senate's views and to authorize him to act as he thought best. He elected to confirm the treaty. 6. If Publius had been inclined to smile over the worries of the government at home, he was rapidly made aware of the true state of the case. His supply fleet from Sicily, caught in a gale, was blown on shore in the neighborhood of Carthage and was seized. The loss was no laughing matter to him. It reprovisioned Carthage at a critical moment when her supplies were short, and it was the clearest breach of the armistice. His representatives, who carried his protest, found a Carthage that had undergone a remarkable change. The warnings with which the Carthaginian government addressed to its citizens had been laughed at. Some vast orb, whose attraction far transcended that of its puny constellation, was crossing its path. It had maintained at Rome the thesis to which the aristocratic party always adhered, that the Spanish dictator and the government of Carthage were distinct and different powers. Now it had grown silent. It heard the envoys without comment. When they left to address the citizen assembly, the reason became plain. They faced a roaring mob, drunk with excitement and hope. Only with difficulty could they gain a hearing. The assembly wanted them held as hostages for the peace envoys at Rome. The Roman representatives spoke words which were fire to the tinder of the Phoenician pride. They remarked on the wonderful change they saw from the florid persons who had bowed down with amicable smiles and voluble protestations. If, they said, the approach of Hannibal were the cause, let them remember that the man who was returning to them came as a fugitive from Italy, not as her conqueror. If Carthage, after breaking the treaty, were again beaten, what terms could she expect from Rome? They exhorted the assembly not to push matters to an issue. The vast orb gliding on towards Africa was far too strong. The assembly, as one man, proceeded to tear up the treaty. Hurried down to the port under the protection of anxious members of the aristocratic party, the Romans were put on board their ship and sent off. They reappeared before Publius not long after with a story of 3 Carthaginian triremes that, as soon as their escort turned back, had pursued them into the mouth of the Bagridas River. They had saved themselves only by running their ship ashore and seeking the protection of Roman troops who noticed their plight. It was clear that the treaty was at an end and the armistice denounced. Who was responsible for it was a question. Someone had an interest in wrecking the treaty. 7. Suddenly, the great planet swam into visibility. Hannibal arrived at Leptis, and his transports landed the Italian army, the famous Old Guard of Trasimenus and Cannae. He came certainly not as a fugitive from Italy, and as certainly not an unsuccessful general recalled by order of his government. He came to look for Publius, and he came as a dictator who was not now confined to the province of Spain, but intended to assert his power in ancient Carthage itself. The assembly at Carthage was electing him amid uproarious enthusiasm, while Publius was pulling up his tent pegs, packing, and making up the Bagridas. Ahead of him galloped the express couriers who went to summon Massinissa. The Carthaginian Hannibal and the Roman Hannibal were in the arena at last, and all the world watched. Publius took the lead without hesitation. He did not mean to be tied to a siege of Carthage, with the risk of being pinned there. His aim was to get into the open, where he could maneuver. The whole of his plans must have been thought out with great rapidity. Their foundation was the fact that Hannibal was short of cavalry. This necessarily followed from his sea voyage. He could not bring cavalry from Italy. Publius, on the other hand, had all Massinissa's Numidians to draw upon, if, that is to say, he and Massinissa could join hands in time. The time factor was of very great importance. Every mile up the Bagridas shortened the road of Massinissa. The Bagridas Valley was the granary of Carthage, and the march of Publius was a clean sweep. He destroyed as he went. His fleet was watching the coast, and he knew that Tiberius Nero was expected with the main Roman armada. The devastation of the Bagridas Valley was the last link that surrounded Carthage with a wall of famine. Hannibal, at Hadrumetum, had been negotiating with the inland tribes for cavalry. From Tychaeus, a kinsman of Syphax, he obtained 2,000 of the best cavalry in Africa. When the Ligurians and Gauls of Mago's army and the Carthaginian levies had effected their concentration, he was in command of a force more numerous than the Roman. Thoroughly alarmed by the proceedings of Publius, the Carthaginians pressed Hannibal for a quick decision. He replied that he would be the judge of when to fight. But as there was nothing to be gained and something to be lost by delay, he almost at once moved. Coming up from the southeast, across the line of Scipio's march, he had on his flank an unspoiled country, whereas Scipio was taking a considerable risk in moving further and further from his base and cutting himself off from it by a belt of devastated land. Hannibal encamped near Zama, while he ascertained the exact position and arrangements of the Roman forces. Publius seems to have been at Naragara, beyond the Bagradas, halted. The essential information which Hannibal desired can only have been the knowledge whether Massinissa had arrived. The Romans were keenly on the alert, for 3 of Hannibal's agents were captured. Publius, instead of executing them, ordered them to be conducted over the camp and shown everything there was to see. Having carefully inquired whether they had had a satisfactory visit, he sent them back under escort, bidding them report in full to their commander. Publius Cornelius Scipio was no fool, and he showed singularly few signs at any period in his life of throwing away his advantages. What he very particularly wanted Hannibal to know was undoubtedly that Massinissa had not arrived. It is highly improbable that Hannibal attributed to him any sentimental reason for his conduct. The communication indirectly conveyed had a meaning, if the Carthaginian could read it aright. What was the meaning? If Publius had wished, without putting it into words, to hint that he was at the end of his tether and would accept any suggestion of a conference, he might well have done just as he did. Without Massinissa, he was at a serious disadvantage, cut off on the edge of the desert with a superior army on his flank. Hannibal had no reason to decline any such hint, and he would have appreciated the method by which it was conveyed. Finally, he sent across an official request that they might meet and discuss the situation. Publius consented, adding that he would communicate to Hannibal the time and place for the interview. 8. Publius came across from Naragara to Margaron, where he dug in close to water in a favorable position. Receiving the expected message, Hannibal moved up and pitched about 3.5 miles distant, where water was much less accessible. His trouble in this respect was the least serious feature in the case. Far more important was the presence of Massinissa. Massinissa had effected his junction with the Romans during the short interval between the return of the spies and the move to Margaron, and that Publius had known of his approach and had been calculating upon it is a deduction which Hannibal would draw if we do not. The upshot of the whole series of maneuvers was that Publius faced Hannibal upon the open plain with advantage of water and a superiority in cavalry. He had grasped and kept the initiative throughout and moved the formidable wizard where he wanted him. And to score off the wizard in this way was a triumph never given to any man but Publius Cornelius Scipio. The interview, nevertheless, took place. It had become even more necessary for Hannibal to form an accurate estimate of the man opposed to him. A clear, flat plain lay between the two camps. The two commanders rode out, each with a small mounted staff. And on this safe neutral ground, they left their escorts and, attended only by their interpreters, met face to face. For a little while they were silent, observing one another, and we would give much to know what they observed. The silence had another purpose. It ascertained the relationship in which they stood to one another. Since Publius did not open the conversation, it became clear, as Hannibal by this time had guessed, that he was not making any appeal for peace. Hannibal does not seem to have revealed by any flicker of eyelash or turn of phrase his perception that he had been hoodwinked. He accepted with inscrutable courtesy the position in which he stood, and he began to speak. The official account of the interview which Publius Scipio handed to the world for publication depicts Hannibal beginning with smooth, very courteous phrases. In reading them, we are chiefly conscious of the deep, warm pile of the velvet glove that covered the iron hand of Hannibal, and the thinner cuticle and sharp, nervous European grip of Scipio. Hannibal regretted that Carthage and Rome, two great empires which had each their natural boundaries, ever allowed themselves to seek possessions outside those limits. But having begun by fighting first for Sicily and then for Spain, they had now gone so far that Rome first and Carthage next had been in serious danger. They ought to find some means of composing their differences. He himself was ready, because he had learnt by experience the changeability of fortune, and how, by slight turns of the balance, she played seesaw with her children. Publius, being new to the game, and having been up all the time so far, might not think that he would ever be down. But he, Hannibal, instanced himself as an example. After Cannae, he had been master of Italy, almost up to the gates of Rome, and now he was trying to secure the safety of his own country. Let him mark that, and not be too sure of himself. Let him take the wise man's course, which is the safest course. Scipio had nothing to win by victory, and all to lose by defeat. Finally, he suggested, as terms, the cession by Carthage of all the lands in dispute, including the Mediterranean islands, with an undertaking never again to claim them. These terms, he thought, gave security to Carthage and honor to Rome. Scipio, according to his own account, replied that the Romans had not been responsible for the wars in Sicily or in Spain. The Carthaginians were the aggressors in both. No one, he continued, with equal untruth, was better aware than he of the fickleness of fortune. But, ceasing to address the Roman public and turning to the consideration of Hannibal's remarks, though the proposed terms, if made before Hannibal had left Italy, would probably have been accepted, the case was changed now that Rome had gained command of Africa and had forced him to evacuate the peninsula. Hannibal was suggesting terms which were less favorable to Rome than the recent treaty which had been torn up, and he could not accept them. The two commanders thereupon parted without arriving at any agreement. At any rate, without any agreement that they cared to report to their respective governments. It is very improbable that Hannibal expected his proposed terms to be considered for a moment. He had offered a gold brick, politely counting upon its rejection. And for this he had very serious reasons. His battle tactics had always been based upon his estimate of the mentality of the opposing commander. The interview afforded him an opportunity of gauging the character and intelligence of Publius Scipio. Faced by the critical battle upon which all depended, no knowledge had ever been more necessary to him than this, and Scipio had been very willing that he should have it. But although he, no less than Scipio, fully intended to fight, nothing in honor prevented them, if they so desired, from a little unofficial conversation on other subjects. If we know nothing whatever on that probability, we may remind ourselves that that is all those two very astute men ever intended us to know. 9. At daybreak next morning, the armies took ground. The interview between the two commanders had had its effect. Neither attempted to take any liberty with the other. The marshalling went off quietly. It was a very serious preparation for a very serious struggle. Any surprises would come later on. Hannibal, though weak in cavalry, was stronger in elephants than he ever had been in Italy. He had over 80, which he set in front of his first line, the Gauls and Ligurians of Mago's army. His second line was composed of the African and Carthaginian levies. Some way behind these, he drew up the Spanish infantry, his own trained and tried veterans. The Carthaginian cavalry and that of Antiochus he assembled on the wings. Unsensational as this arrangement appeared, it presented some very difficult problems. The elephants were an attacking arm which definitely placed the tactical initiative in the hands of Hannibal. There were recognized methods of repulsing them. But if a definite decision were to be reached this day, the method must be one which did not hinder the chief power of the Roman infantry, its mobility on the field. Moreover, no methods of staking the ground were possible to Scipio. The equipment was lacking and could hardly be improvised upon the spot. He therefore set out his infantry, not, as was the usual rule, in echelon, but in file of maniples, so that straight lines ran through. His light troops he ranged in front, with very careful instructions as to their procedure. The Italian cavalry under Laelius were massed on the left, Massinissa's horse on the right. These dispositions seem to have been completed while both commanders attentively studied each other's tactical scheme and made the final adjustments. 10. The first casual skirmishing of the Numidian horse was followed by the signal from Hannibal, and the elephants began their onslaught. It was a tremendous one. The light troops broke and bolted with the ferocious beasts among them. Their first move, however, was met with a blast of trumpets and bugles from all the assembled instruments of the Roman legions. The uproar, no doubt as cacophonic as experienced musicians could manage to mix it, sent the less trained elephants careering back towards the Numidians, who were already in contact on the southerly wing. There Massinissa's men, with little to learn about elephants, saluted them with a shower of darts. They did not long endure these banderilla tactics, but rushed madly in among the horsemen of Antiochus, and Massinissa gave the word to charge. In one rush he had the whole mass going, and Antiochus, elephants, and Massinissa disappeared like a whirlwind into the distance. The light troops, meanwhile, pursued by the rest of the elephants, poured back into the lanes between the Roman squares, which held tight to their formations. Had the Romans been drawn up in their customary echelons, they would probably have been broken. Coming up over the trampled wreckage of the light troops, the elephants had to face the unnerving trumpets and weighted javelins of the legions. They were not well trained enough for that. Some of them, taking the line of least resistance, hurried along the lanes out into the open at the Roman rear, where no more is heard of them. Others ran back and wandered along the Roman front till they came to the cavalry wing, where they were saluted by a fresh storm of spears, with the result that they bolted into the Carthaginian cavalry. Laelius followed upon their heels, and he, elephants, Carthaginians, and all were soon emulating Massinissa into the distance. 11. The advance of the Roman first line must have been fairly prompt. Hannibal either had no opportunity for maneuver, or, as is probable, he had other intentions. The massed ranks of Gallic and Ligurian troops, strengthened with Mauritanian archers and Balearic slingers, at first held fast, but after a severe struggle were broken and thrown back upon the Carthaginian and African foot. These, warned beforehand, refused to break their ranks or receive the fugitives, but stood steady in rank. The Roman first line, coming up over the ground littered with slain and slippery with blood, was completely repulsed. Publius ordered his second line to advance. It hesitated a little, but went in, and the Carthaginians were broken. The old guard would not receive the fugitives, but stood with lowered spears until they had dispersed. When they had gone, and their position was a trap from which few could escape, the Romans, badly damaged, confronted the fresh army of Cannae, more numerous than themselves, and veterans as well trained and equipped. The tactics of Hannibal at Zama were new to him, and were based upon a profound respect for the lessons which Publius Scipio had learned at Cannae. His aim throughout had been to wear Publius down by hard pounding, and then to confront him with an overwhelming superiority of strength. This he had successfully done. The situation of Scipio, when the army of Cannae was unmasked, was no enviable one. With inferior forces, half of which had been broken, he faced fresh troops of historic invincibility. If Antiochus and the Carthaginian horse could keep Laelius and Massinissa running for a short time more, the latter might return to find the Roman army no longer in being. Publius did not flinch. In the pause which ensued, he reorganized and rearranged his forces, consolidating his old first line and wheeling out his second and third lines to the wings to overlap Hannibal. He carried out his movements unhurriedly. The wizard made no attempt to move, or maneuver, or counterattack in the face of Roman infantry. He stood perfectly steady, and he was the best judge of his own wisdom. When the Roman infantry closed upon the Spaniards, the real struggle began. Owing to the attitude of the Senate during the year of Scipio's consulship, it was no ordinary levy that he commanded, but picked volunteer veterans of the Spanish campaigns, and not a few of the actual survivors of Cannae, whom the Senate had allowed him to take from their exile in Sicily. The contest between these men and the Spanish infantry was bitter, desperate, and unflinching. But it was not a level fight. The Spaniards were fresh, as well as more numerous. If both commanders had not their hearts in their mouths when it came clear that the day was turning in favor of the Spaniards, they were either more or less than men. A very short time, possibly, would have seen the Roman line dwindle, break, and roll up, when the whirlwind sprang up again in the desert, and back, only in the nick of time, rode Laelius and Massinissa. The verdict was given. It was Cannae again. The Spaniards mostly fell or surrendered where they stood. Those that got away out of the slaughter would have little chance against the Numidian horse on the level open plain. In this way, the Battle of Cannae came home again on its victor. 12. Hannibal, with his staff, reached Hadrumetum in safety. He waited there a few days, till he knew the feeling of his countrymen. Then they sent to recall him to Carthage, and he went. That impassive, enigmatic mask, which throughout his days of success had concealed the thoughts and emotions of Hannibal, hid them no less closely now. He arrived at Carthage as clear, as decisive, and as self-controlled as if he had been the victor of Zama. In reply to questions, he told the council that there was no alternative to surrender. To the very humble deputation which accordingly waited upon him, Scipio gave no direct answer. He invited a conference at Tunis. There, after he had dryly let the Carthaginian envoys sing their song, he presented his terms. They ran as follows. 1. Autonomy for Carthage and full possession of her African territory. 2. Surrender of all fugitives and deserters. 3. Surrender of all ships of war save 10, and of all elephants. No more elephants to be trained. 4. No war, either in or out of Africa without the consent of Rome. 5. Full restitution to Massinissa. 6. Full maintenance for the Roman forces until the ratification of the peace. 7. A war indemnity of 10,000 talents of silver to be paid in equal annual installments over a period of 50 years. 8. 100 hostages to be delivered, over 14 and under 31 years of age. And finally, 9. No treaty or armistice to be considered until the transports and cargoes were restored. When these terms were laid before the citizen assembly at Carthage, one enthusiastic diehard, shocked at their nature, rose amid general agreement to advocate their rejection. Before he had gone far, Hannibal had risen to his feet, thrown him off the rostrum, and faced the assembly. To the emphatically expressed disapproval of the meeting at this breach of decorum, he began by a brief apology. I left Carthage when I was 9 years old. 36 years have given me a tolerable acquaintance with the art of war, but my education in civic procedure you must attend to. My action is reasonable in the spirit, if not according to the letter. For when I think of the way in which we should have treated Rome in a like case, I cannot conceive how any rational man can do other than thank heaven for such terms as these. He then spoke at length in demonstration of the necessity of accepting the treaty, and he brought the assembly over to his view. From his subsequent actions, we can guess the full import of that view. He had not lost hope. Calmly and lucidly, he foresaw the possibility of rebuilding the power of Carthage. Approved by the Carthaginian assembly, the treaty was referred by Scipio to Rome. It did not pass unopposed. The Senate at length referred it to the Roman assembly, which gave the Senate authority to conclude peace and nominated Publius Scipio to negotiate the terms. The treaty was therefore ratified and put into execution. 13. But this treaty was, as we have seen, carried through the Carthaginian assembly only by the influence of Hannibal, and it was carried through the Roman and forced upon the Senate only by the influence of Publius Scipio. It was their treaty, and we are left wondering what more took place during that interview before the Battle of Zama, which we shall never know until all secrets are revealed. As Livy hints, Publius could make what he liked of it, since there was no one to check him. And over Hannibal's share in it lies a silence deep as the grave. It is certain that there was afterwards a curious sympathy and mutual understanding between the two great commanders. And if they, knowing that one of them must be defeated, did not secretly settle their terms before the Battle of Zama was fought, it looks at any rate very like it. 14. Where the shoe pinched was seen when the first payment of the war indemnity was arranged. The culmination of bitter disappointment, wounded pride, and hope deferred affected men in various ways. The aristocratic party in the council wept when it was clear that special taxation must be imposed. It was then that Hannibal laughed. Kid Hasdrubal, their leader, asked him whether he intended to insult them on the miseries of which he had been the cause. Hannibal made it clear that his laughter had been of a harsher kind. He said, "I laugh because you weep over the least of your misfortunes." 15. But Publius returned to Rome, the greatest man that had trodden its stones since Tarquinius Superbus, and there were those who thought the likeness close. End of Chapter 11. Publius Scipio and the Struggle in Africa. Read by Mark Harrington, Framingham, Massachusetts. Chapter 12 of Hannibal by George Philip Baker. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Antiochus Megas and the Struggle in Asia. 1. Hannibal, in Carthage, was almost as much a stranger as he would have been in Rome. He scarcely knew more of one city than of the other. Nothing held him to Carthage, save the accident that he was born there and that her language was his childhood's tongue. He was a cosmopolitan, a citizen of the great Mediterranean civilization, uninterested in its local differences and unable to see it, save as essentially one beneath all its familiar varieties. For his fellow citizens of the aristocratic party, he had neither admiration nor sympathy. Though he retained his authority, it was natural enough that after Zama and the treaty which followed it, he should not wield the undisputed power he had once exercised. His policy, therefore, though it may have shown an imperturbable hope and faith, was the natural outcome of the ways in which he habitually saw the world. The situation after the Treaty of Peace was emphatically not one to give him any reason for despair. Rome had all her troubles before her. Moreover, the investigation into the resources of Carthage, which he set on foot as soon as peace was restored, seems to have been very encouraging. The commercial prosperity of the city had scarcely been injured. With prudence and good administration, Carthage might recover herself more quickly than Rome. The airy fabric of Carthaginian credit and financial prosperity was likely to survive, while Roman fields lay untilled, and the brute material of the earth waited for hands to restore its fertility. His interest was directed particularly to the east, whither ours may for a moment follow it. 2. Now, while Hannibal was besieging Saguntum, crossing the Alps, fighting Cannae, and going through all that long adventure which, for the time being, ended at Zama, events of a serious nature had been taking place in the eastern Mediterranean. Antiochus of Syria, as a direct descendant of Seleucus Nicator, had determined to restore the empire of Alexander. Whether or not his confidence of success were well grounded, no one could question that his growing power would at least sway the balance of affairs in the Mediterranean. Much, of course, would depend upon the circumstances in which it was brought to bear, and to effect these was the object of Hannibal. Antiochus had already exercised a good deal of influence upon the course of events. He had been responsible for King Philip's change of attention from the west to the east. His full weight was beginning to tell just when, after Zama, Hannibal was searching for a third party to counterbalance the prospective supremacy of Rome. The death of Ptolemy Philopator of Egypt in 205 BC and the accession of Ptolemy Epiphanes, a minor, made it certain that great alterations in the political balance would soon be in progress. They began by the alliance between Antiochus and Philip for the purpose of dividing up the Asiatic provinces of Egypt. The landslide was now started. The Egypt of the Ptolemies was not the backward minor state with which the modern observer is familiar. She was among the most civilized, the richest, and the best organized states then existing, holding almost a monopoly of the Indian trade, which Antiochus wanted for the Syrian overland route, a center of learning, and a great sea power. A war in which Egypt was involved might pull the roof in upon the Mediterranean politics of the day. Astute Egyptian diplomatists ensured that it should not fall upon them. They gracefully placed young Ptolemy under the guardianship of the greatest of the Western powers. They selected the Roman Senate. The vast and somewhat conventional powers concerned took a little time to get going over this tremendous business. It was only in the year after Zama that Philip crossed to Asia and began his attack on the Greek cities. The campaign was soon passing down the Aegean with some of the effects of a cyclone. Rhodes declared war. The fleets of the Rhodian League soon put another complexion upon affairs. King Attalus of Pergamus, a Roman ally, was involved. Rome made diplomatic overtures. Philip's action had, as its first result, his own isolation. He had proved an extraordinarily bad diplomatist, for after failing to support Hannibal when he could have done so without danger, he had embroiled himself with Rome, alienated Egypt, and offended the Greek cities. And he had put his trust in Antiochus, an ally who was certain sooner or later to assert his own claim to Macedonia. The crisis came when two Macedonian partisans illegitimately intruded into the Eleusinian mysteries. Philip may have been right in considering that their execution by the Athenians was an excessive punishment for what he asserted to be an unintentional offense, but until its unintentional nature was clear, he was unwise to invade Attica. The Athenians, with the support of Egypt, appealed to Rome, and Rome was drawn into the maelstrom that began to circle around King Antiochus. 3. The Senate, seeing that it must either protect its friends or openly abandon them, prepared for war. The assembly heard the suggestion with horror. There was nothing it wanted less. The strain on the temper and finances of Roman citizens was too much. Earnest propaganda was necessary before it could be persuaded that the Senate was not actuated by sinister motives. The argument employed was Hannibal. When the assembly heard the contention that there was no choice between peace and war, but only between fighting Philip in Macedonia or fighting him in Italy, it gave way. The parallel with Saguntum and the remembrance of Pyrrhus were too much for the electors. That Carthage had not been crushed, that Hannibal stood quietly waiting in the background, biding his time, were thoughts never far from the surface of men's minds. While the preparations for war with Philip were being pushed forward, such feelings were revived by disturbing news from the north. The unrest in Cisalpine Gaul, which for a generation had been smoldering, dying down, and leaping up again, sprang into a blaze that might have been the herald of a new conflagration. 3 Gallic and several Ligurian tribes combined under the command of a Carthaginian officer of Mago's army named Hamilcar, who had been left behind, probably wounded, when Mago sailed away. A force 40,000 strong sacked Placentia, crossed the Padus, and marched on Cremona. The garrison shut the gates and sent an express for help. It reached an unhappy praetor who, with only some 5,000 men under his command, was helpless. The Senate was not disturbed. It sent out orders for the reinforcement of the praetor's army, and it sent a commission to Carthage to demand the recall and surrender of Hamilcar. The Carthaginian government protested that it could do nothing but sentence him to exile and confiscate his property. Hannibal, still the commander of the Carthaginian army, and in virtue of that fact, still dictator, had to bear the responsibility for Hamilcar. It is possible that the aristocratic party suspected him of having a finger in that pie. At any rate, he vacated the post, and after an interval joined the judicial board, which was the stronghold of Carthaginian aristocracy. It is not probable that he was welcome there, but his status and influence must have made indisputable his right to a seat. 4. The operations of the first year of the Macedonian War gave the Romans no cause for enthusiasm. Philip's elation found some reflection in Carthage, where the failure of the Romans raised hopes which increased the influence of Hannibal. Any satisfaction which the aristocrats had derived from their victory of the previous year was wiped out with the payment of the first installment of the war indemnity. It was paid in silver. The quaestors who weighed the bullion, dissatisfied with it, reported to the Senate. Assay proved that the metal was fully a fourth below standard. The disgraced Carthaginian envoys were compelled to borrow from Roman bankers to make good the deficit. The Senate was by no means hard upon them. It restored 100 of the hostages, with the good-humored promise that the rest should follow if Carthage fulfilled her treaty obligations. But the tolerance of the Senate, which was not free from suspicion of bias in favor of Hannibal's political enemies, does not seem to have been imitated at Carthage. Hannibal immediately came back to power, and he was not long in obtaining authority to probe into the roots of the scandal. His first actions brought him into collision with the power of the judicial board. Attempting to question one of the officers of the treasury, he found himself treated with defiance. The man was an adherent of the aristocratic party and expected to become a member of the board. It was not safe, however, to defy the old disciplinarian of the army of Cannae. He promptly had the man arrested and produced before the assembly. On the address which Hannibal then delivered to the citizens of Carthage, a great deal hung. It embodied one of these constitutional crises which determine the fate of nations. In order to understand it, we may review the case he had to make. As far back as the time just precedent to Gello and the Battle of Himera, there had been a clash of political principles at Carthage. The trouble lay in the continual effort of the Phoenician aristocracy of Carthage to restrain and prevent the individual discretion of its great commanders. From contests of this kind, there is no escaping. We can illustrate it by the similar contests that were waged at Rome, and that in later ages found their consummation in Caesarism. The Romans succeeded in keeping their control by normal constitutional means, but at some time after the revolt and fall of Malchus, the Carthaginians established the judicial board of 100 members now in question, the aim of which was to control the military commanders. This board was one of the most effective instruments ever invented for such a purpose, but its power grew until it became the real governing body of Carthage, and the whole of Carthaginian life passed under its scrutiny. As a purely negative force, its purpose was not active government, but the prevention of action. It exerted a power to stifle, not a power to act. The effect of such a body became clearly visible towards the end of the First Punic War. It was a paralyzing and inhibiting effect, strangling every effort to introduce new ideas or new methods, defeating every original or independent personality. We have seen how Hamilcar Barca treated the problem. He founded a dictatorship in Spain outside the circle of regular government. Hannibal had inherited this dictatorship. His return home brought him face to face with the old problem. Carthage was no longer a single commercial city. It had become the center of a dominion embracing many various peoples. Were the imagined interests of men too stupid and too cowardly to take large views, so to act as a brake upon the strong and the foreseeing? Was Carthage, like some kind of madman, to die by holding her breath? This was the case Hannibal put to the assembly. Which were they to have, the selfish cowards or the men of bold ideas and vigorous action? Would they at any rate die fighting or die of inanition? The assembly had no two minds. He had not come to his peroration before he saw the current of opinion setting fast for him, just as that of the Roman assembly set for Scipio. He concluded, therefore, by putting the motion that the members of the judicial board should no longer be irremovable, but should submit themselves annually for re-election. It was carried. When he stepped down from the rostrum, it was as a new Heracles, competent to turn out the Augean stable of Carthaginian domestic government. Even Hamilcar had never won such a victory as this. 5. Had the course of the Macedonian War continued favorable to Philip, Hannibal's return to power might have been permanent. But a change took place when Titus Quintius Flamininus, a soldier of the school of Scipio, was appointed to the command in Greece. By dint of acting with courtesy, tact, and intelligence, Flamininus left behind him a name which speedily came to rank among the minor immortals. The smaller Greek states were almost pathetically grateful to find a Roman who acted as if he understood them. Antiochus, busy with the conquest of Palestine, did not send the help that Philip might have looked for, and in this critical moment, Philip fought the war alone. At the Battle of Cynocephalae, Macedonia, which had risen to the hegemony of Greece, overthrown Persia, and extended its rule to Bactria and India, came to a sudden and calamitous termination, and for the time being she disappeared from history. Though one hope of Hannibal had thus gone, the game was still far from being played out. The fall of Philip rendered it only the more certain that Antiochus would now be obliged to try conclusions with Rome. Philip had always been a fool. Antiochus might prove a more capable statesman. He had, at least, the material resources for the task. Since Hannibal had never, at any time, possessed military force sufficient to achieve his objects by that means alone, war had never for him been anything but a method of exercising political leverage on those who did. Even if, in the short, immediate sense, he had not been successful, there still remained the possibility of exercising that leverage in another way, without the intermediation of war. A great league of Mediterranean powers would face a Rome which was very far indeed from being the Rome of 20 years ago. From this point of view, it was no paradox to contend that even after Zama, Hannibal's war-making might have achieved its intended object. If such a league could be formed, the military power of Carthage could rapidly be reconstituted. Finally, an inconclusive, mutually exhausting war between Rome and Syria would leave Carthage in an extremely favorable position. Attalus of Pergamus had already appealed to Rome for protection, and although the Senate was slow in taking up the matter, Antiochus was sure to act if the Senate did not. Thrace and Macedonia were integral portions of the empire of Alexander. Greece was a political appanage of Macedonia, and Antiochus would not fail in any event to assert his claim to them. To count on a war between Antiochus and Rome was therefore perfectly safe. And whether Antiochus turned out to be a faithful and intelligent ally, or whether he proved another Philip, Hannibal stood to gain. This was sound reasoning, but there were matters in which his reasoning was not so sound. It might have been wiser for him not to have challenged the position of the Carthaginian aristocracy. Hamilcar's policy might have paid him better, had there but been another Spain. 6. There were others who could perceive these things. The Senate had to face the unwelcome fact that it could not slip out of a war with Syria. To allow Antiochus to make good his claims to Macedonia and Greece, and to confront Rome with a great power stretching from the Adriatic coast to India, was not to be thought of. No great intelligence was required to see that in such a case Carthage would become once more a pressing danger. So far from the war having ended at Zama, it looked as if Zama had but closed a chapter, and that the tale would reopen with more formidable omens. In such circumstances, Hannibal's foes were sure of a hearing in Rome. 7. It was perhaps not at first certain whether they could adduce sufficient ground for Roman intervention. The defeat of the judicial board had opened the way to a thorough survey of the financial resources of Carthage. The investigations brought to light a considerable amount of highly interesting evidence. The fact that Carthage was immensely rich must sometimes have puzzled those of her sons who wrestled with the unaccountable truth that she often had no money. Hannibal's investigation solved this strange problem. It revealed peculation and incompetence upon an immense scale. The Semitic gentleman who had attempted to pass off upon the Roman quaestors bullion a fourth under standard, and who had wept at the idea of fresh taxation, were robbing the treasury and wasting its money right and left. Hannibal undertook that the war indemnity should be paid from the current resources of Carthage, without the imposition of fresh taxes, and he made good his word. While this was hardly a crime, it was not much more pleasant hearing to the Senate than to those whose peculations had been stopped. The Senate had undoubtedly intended the war indemnity to be a crippling burden, and, at the time when it was calculated, it no doubt so appeared to be, in proportion to the financial resources of Carthage. The difficulties attending a war with Antiochus made more urgent still such preliminary diplomatic action as could be achieved. The Romans were still comparatively new to foreign wars. Sicily, Spain, and Africa they had undertaken, the two latter only through the individual enterprise of Publius Scipio, and, with even smaller forces, the mainland of Greece. But to fight Antiochus on his own soil meant an enterprise such as no Roman army had ever attempted. The first necessity, therefore, was to exhaust every available means of reducing the power of Antiochus beforehand, and action against Carthage might be held to come under this head. The decision to intervene at Carthage was not immediately nor unanimously reached. Publius Scipio for long opposed, as below the dignity of Rome, any attempt to take sides in Carthaginian politics, or to help Hannibal's domestic enemies to hound down a great man. But Scipio himself had not perfectly clean hands. He, too, belonged to the tiny but terrible party of the cosmopolitan autocrats. What turned the scale was the assurance that Hannibal was in touch with Antiochus. It was at length decided to send a commission to Africa to lay before the Carthaginians the allegation that Hannibal was in communication with an enemy of Rome. 8. Hannibal had either a guilty conscience, as his enemies suspected, or an unusually good secret service, as his friends may believe. He had no doubt as to the purpose of the commission, and he was fully prepared. During the day before the commissioners had their first official audience, he showed himself carefully in public. At dusk, he went to the city gate. There his horse met him. Ordering his two servants to await his return, he rode out, as if for an evening gallop. That night and the day following, he rode 130 miles, through Zugatana into Byzacium, striking the coast at his villa between Aquila and Thapsus. A ship was waiting, and bullion was ready packed for transport. He was at Cercina before the next night. Phoenician ships were in harbor. He was recognized and hailed with enthusiasm, too much enthusiasm for his purpose. He therefore invited the ship's officers on shore and told them to bring their sails to make an awning against the sun. Sailors do not seem to have changed much in some characteristics with the lapse of ages. When they awoke, late next day, the wizard had gone like the morning mist, and as it took them time to get their sails back on board, the news reached Carthage later still. His antechamber had been thronged with disturbed partisans. When it was realized that he was not to be found, the wildest rumors were current. It was believed that he had been murdered by the Romans. By the time the ships from Cercina had revealed the truth, the wizard was far away on blue water on the easterly passage. 2 fast ships were sent after him. They did not find him. His foes relieved their feelings and placated the angry Romans by confiscating his property, razing his house, and declaring him outlaw. They also apparently provided the commissioners with a quantity of sensational fiction calculated to divert attention in Rome from their customary failure to deliver the goods. The commissioners went home to report that a great conspiracy had been unearthed. The Macedonian War, the coming Syrian War, a revolt of Carthage, and many events that never happened were part of the wizard's plans. It may have been so, but he was more accustomed to take advantage of the opportunities kindly provided by others. 9. So closed his attempt to govern and to restore Carthage. The blow was directed at him from Carthage itself. The fate of Malchus had befallen him, and when we see the mentality which sacrificed, from such motives, her only hope, we need look no further for the causes which led to the ultimate collapse and disappearance of Carthaginian power. Those who betrayed him could no doubt have adduced reasons and motives with the color of plausibility. The party which entertained the conviction that the safety of Carthage depended upon avoiding pride and ambition, and upon concentrating upon the humble task of making money, must have had a singular conception of the view taken of commerce by such men as the directors of the Roman state. Commerce is a political fact. As long as man is a political animal, commerce will be the method by which the mutual relations of men are established and expanded. Control of money and exchange is so indissolubly connected with the control and government of men that the two gravitate together into the hands of those who exercise the greater political activity. The gift for marketing is a form of power, and a form of power can never be a fact politically neutral. Hence, only a profound misconception of the very elements of the case could ever lead men to suppose that a commercial system could in any sense be maintained without all those other activities which we specifically distinguish by the word political. The exile of Hannibal thus implied that Carthage relinquished the one power which could hold her commercial interests together, and the one purpose, that is to say government, for which those interests were ultimately valuable. And the fall of Carthage, when it came, was the conclusive proof that the whole idea upon which the Phoenicians had originally based their proceedings, and from which they had only half-heartedly and inadequately departed, the idea of a non-political commerce, was an illusion. The rich man who possesses no political significance may exist in utopia, but nowhere else. 10. Hannibal's welcome at Tyre was very different. He was honored as the most famous and distinguished of her sons. He basked in a little refreshing admiration for a few days, and then went on to Antioch. The king had left for Ephesus, but his son continued the friendly welcome to the great Carthaginian. Following to Ephesus, Hannibal found the king, who embraced him as a messenger from heaven. So far, all was hopeful. The king already saw the world at his feet. It would be hard to believe that the Roman diplomatists had quite meant this. They had hoped to see Hannibal finally suppressed. Certainly they had not intended to throw him into the arms of Antiochus. They were more successful in their other operations. When Publius Scipio gained his second consulship in the ensuing year, he had schemes for naming Macedonia a consular province, with, of course, at the back of his mind, an idea that it might fall to him. The Senate interfered to prevent this. Its own cosmopolitan autocrat was accordingly shelved, and had no opportunity of fighting any more battles of Zama, while the Senate proceeded to carry out a coup of another sort. The suppression of Macedonia had been achieved by the policy identified with the name of Titus Quintus Flamininus, that of detaching the republican city-states of Greece from support of the Macedonian monarchy. While Philip's military power was derived entirely from Macedonia itself, the financial resources which alone could enable him to fight a considerable war were drawn from the Greek states. Hence, the diplomacy of Flamininus practically decided the result before the military issue was fought out. Flamininus, with the support of the Senate, played his game squarely. Not only did he restore the sovereign autonomy of the city-states of European Hellas, but he intervened on behalf of the Asiatic Greek cities. The aim of the Senate was now to preserve the influence so acquired. If Antiochus could win over the city-states, the coming war would be fought close to Italy, perhaps, ultimately, even on Italian soil. If they could be kept solid for the Roman interest, the war might be fought in Asia. The Senate therefore decided upon a singularly bold step. It instructed Flamininus to withdraw the Roman garrisons from European Greece, and thus to carry out his policy to the logical end. The ardent political idealists of Greece could scarcely believe their senses. Their enthusiasm and gratitude are touching, even over this long retrospect. When Flamininus mentioned that he would like to take home with him all Hannibal's Italian prisoners working in Greece as slaves, they rushed to oblige him and were delighted to foot the bill. No honor, perhaps, was ever better deserved than the 3 days' triumph of Flamininus. He left behind him a land indeed at his feet, but with thanks, and the captives who marched in his procession were not foreigners enslaved, but his own people set free from servitude. There was no danger. The astute statesmen at Rome were counting, and did not count in vain, upon human nature and the force of circumstances. With their determined idealism and their system of confederate leagues, the city-states were in no position to hold their ground against a centralized military monarchy such as that of Antiochus. When the pull came, Antiochus might assert as loudly as he liked that he came to free them from the crushing tyranny of Rome. They would draw instinctively towards the powerful protection of the Republican Roman state, which had not merely proclaimed their freedom, but withdrawn its troops. 11. Against this shrewd calculation, the advice of Hannibal was founded upon an equally shrewd judgment of the military situation. As a military expert, he laid before Antiochus his own plans. He asked for a fleet of 100 decked ships and a striking force of 10,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry. He proposed to touch first at Carthage, where he thought he had the ground fully prepared, and then he would land at some point in Italy, the identity of which he withheld. The king could meanwhile enter Greece and hold himself ready to cooperate as and when circumstances directed. This information came to the astonished Senate from Carthage itself. A mission arrived from the aristocratic party with a somewhat confused and unsatisfactory story. It was alleged that, in accordance with the foregoing plan, Hannibal had dispatched to Carthage a man named Aristo, a Tyrian, fully instructed with the details necessary to bring him into touch with the Barcid party. This man was detected. As nothing had been committed to writing, it was impossible to bring these allegations to the test of proof. The Barcids, vehemently denying the statements made, pointed out with reason that if Tyrians in Carthage were arrested on flimsy suspicions, there would be reprisals against Carthaginians in Tyre. The aristocratic party, however, determined to denounce the affair at Rome. Apparently, they could not see that they injured themselves as much as they injured their opponents. The Senate, a good deal disturbed, answered by declining to support Carthage against the aggressions of Massinissa. It seemed the wisest course on general principles to embarrass Carthage. For all that, the allegations were probably true, and we may find some confirmation of their substance in the significant way in which the diplomatic situation was spun out by Antiochus. Envoys were coming and going. Titus Flamininus, sitting as chairman of a committee of foreign affairs in Rome, rejected the contention of Antiochus that he had an hereditary claim to Macedonia. The envoys asked for time to report, and there was delay and consideration and all the usual methods of filling in time. A Roman commission was appointed to interview Antiochus personally. If Hannibal's plans had been discovered and frustrated, there was reason for this, and for the distinct decline of his prestige in the eyes of Antiochus. Antiochus made every effort to secure his own position. He made young Ptolemy his son-in-law. Ariarathes of Cappadocia he similarly attached, while he offered Eumenes of Pergamus a third alliance. The Aetolian League made overtures to him, which turned his attention still further from Hannibal's plans. The Roman commissioners, on their way to meet Antiochus, were instructed to turn aside to make sure of Eumenes. They had other instructions also. Reaching Ephesus in the king's absence, Publius Villius paid particular attention to Hannibal, whom he constantly visited. His aim was to discover, if he could, Hannibal's intentions, and, at the same time, to reassure him concerning the attitude of Rome towards him personally. As nothing is recorded of his results, it is to be supposed that they were nil. Eumenes, however, was only too glad to ally himself with the Romans, and the interviews of Villius with Hannibal had one indirect result. They shook his status with Antiochus. A conference between the commissioners and the king had no result except to make him abandon the attempt to negotiate. An interview between Minio, his principal adviser, and the commissioners only led to a further warm exchange of views. Publius Sulpicius Galba, a bluff man, was very emphatic in pointing out the insubstantial nature of the king's claims. They were, in fact, attempts to find adequate justification for the political unification of the East. The sound prosaic arguments of detail were all on the side of the Romans. As no compromise could be reached, the commissioners withdrew. The real issue was whether the Eastern Mediterranean was to come under the control of an Asiatic or a European government, and that was not a question capable of being settled by argument. 12. To the council which the king summoned for the final decisions, Hannibal was not invited. That the councillors almost fought one another in their zeal to advise war was its least serious feature. Far worse was the kind of advice tendered. Alexander the Acarnanian advocated, and apparently carried, the plan of landing in Greece, depending on help from Philip of Macedon in the north, the Aetolians in the center, and Nabis of Sparta in the south. Hannibal was to go to Africa in order to divert the attention of the Romans. He probably got wind of what was happening, for he managed to obtain speech with Antiochus while the council was breaking up. Pressed to the point by a direct question, Antiochus said that he had been unfavorably impressed by Hannibal's repeated interviews with Villius. This was probably not the whole truth, but Hannibal accepted it as if it were, and told Antiochus the story of the oath his father Hamilcar Barca had administered to him as a child. Talking to an Oriental despot of the type of Antiochus is a delicate business. Hannibal probably took a carefully calculated risk when he ended upon a harsh note. He told Antiochus that that oath had driven him from one land to another, seeking its fulfillment. If Antiochus needed help against Rome, he, Hannibal, was ready. If not, he would seek a place where he was wanted. Antiochus was in the mood to find this kind of talk acceptable, and he once more smiled upon Hannibal. But he did nothing more than smile. The opportunities that Antiochus was throwing away with such plenitude can be illustrated by the plans attributed to him in Rome. Wartime rumors were active. He was said to be intending to send a fleet to Sicily, and a special defense force was actually raised against the danger. The Senate sent a commission headed by Titus Flamininus to the Greek cities to keep them steady. It had not miscalculated. The only element in Greece that Flamininus could not hold was the Aetolian. The latter grandly, in the spirit of the Skibberine eagle, declared war. When he asked for a copy of the declaration, they surpassed even that celebrated organ by telling him that they would hand it to him on the banks of the Tiber. It may possibly have been the news of this episode that inspired Hannibal to the third exhibition of bad temper he gave in the course of a fairly lengthy life. The philosopher Phormio had held forth somewhat exhaustively in a lecture at which he was present on the principles of command in war, and Hannibal was asked to express an opinion. He said, "I have heard many old fools in my time, but never such a ridiculous old fool as this." And so Phormio achieved immortality. He fought in vain against human stupidity and human vanity. The king bungled his first steps. Antiochus could not even capture the Asiatic Greek cities. The ships for Hannibal's African expedition were not ready. The Aetolians then raised the question whether it ought to be made. Having involved themselves with Rome, they stopped at nothing in order to get Antiochus between themselves and the Romans. Antiochus liked to hear their declarations that Greece was only waiting to fall upon his neck. In view of this alleged enthusiasm, which was the figment of their own interested fancy, they urged him not to divert a ship or a man from Greece. Hannibal, they argued, was a dangerous adventurer, working entirely for his own hand. The general result of his campaigns would, no doubt, consist of a series of sensational victories, in view of which the importance of Hannibal would go up like a rocket, and the importance of Antiochus and his advisers would come down like a stick. Greeks were not Greeks for nothing. The hellish ingenuity of this argument lay in its element of truth. Antiochus and his advisers suddenly decided that Hannibal need not go to Africa. 13. Worse remained. Antiochus crossed the Aegean from Imbros and landed at Demetrias with a force of 10,000 infantry, 500 horse, and 6 elephants. To the horrified Aetolians, he apologized for the smallness of his force. His enormous hosts, he assured them, were on the way. As it was inadequate even for an occupation of Greece, let alone a war with the Romans, the Aetolians hesitated. Ultimately, they joined him. The enthusiasm of Greece was conspicuous by its absence. At Chalcis, some inquiring interest was expressed in the identity of the mysterious Greeks he had come to liberate. The Boeotians hedged. The Achaean League, swayed by a sarcastic speech from Flamininus, refused to have anything to do with Antiochus. The winter was wasted in these useless proceedings. At last, at a council held at Demetrius, Hannibal spoke out. He informed the king that the only hope was to gain the alliance of Philip of Macedon. His own view was, and had always been, that the war should be carried into Italy. And if he had had his way, the Romans would not now be hearing of the capture of Chalcis, but of war at their own doors. He advised the immediate calling up of all the forces the king could raise, the dispatch of a fleet to Corcyra, to watch the crossing from Brundusium, and of another to the Campanian coast. He wound up by remarking that even if he did not know everything about war, he did know how to fight the Romans. None of these recommendations was put into force, except that the army and fleet from Asia were sent for. After pottering about after small local alliances, Antiochus managed to offend Philip, who at once got furiously into touch with the Romans. Various communities protested against the presence of Antiochus in Greece. In spring, the Roman consul Manius Acilius Glabrio crossed from Brundusium at his leisure, without opposition. Antiochus was developing a fresh respect for Hannibal, all of whose pessimistic predictions were coming true. The Aetolians turned up with a very small contingent. Antiochus accordingly retired upon the historic pass of Thermopylae. We are not told that it was Hannibal who advised this simple step, and perhaps it was too obvious to call for the exertion of genius, but he could certainly have done no better. Behind the entanglements he built at Thermopylae, he did not think he could be easily dislodged, and the Romans had no great hopes on that score. It was left to the terrible censor, Cato himself, to inflict the last disgrace. Antiochus could not even hold Thermopylae. Picked like a snail from a shell, he and his staff reached Elatia, got safely to Chalcis, and escaped by sea. Very little of his army escaped the Roman pursuit. 14. Hannibal was the only person who dared to tell him the cold truth. When it became obvious that the king thought the war over, Hannibal told him that, far from this being the case, the only cause for surprise was that the Romans were not already in Asia. Antiochus bestirred himself to do what he could. A more formidable competitor than Acilius Glabrio was by now on his way to deal with the main armies of Antiochus. Publius Scipio had not been successful in his efforts to gain the eastern command. The Senate, utilizing the prestige of Titus Flamininus, had seen to this. Too prudent to press his own claims further, Publius ran his brother Lucius for the consulship, got him in, and proceeded to conduct him personally to the east, where Lucius, on the whole, competently carried out the task of signing the official orders laid before him by his brother. Indecisive sea fighting was still worrying up and down the Aegean. Publius therefore took the land route by the straits. By this time, Antiochus had altogether lost the offensive. His efforts had to be directed towards preventing Publius Scipio from entering Asia. The operations of the fleets would decide whether the passage of the straits could be made. Hannibal hastened southward to use his influence in raising a Phoenician fleet. After successful operations in the north by the Roman admiral to clear the way for the land army, news came that the Rhodian fleet had been entrapped and beaten by the Syrian admiral Polixenidas, who was free to move. The Roman fleet hurried to the spot, but Polixenidas promptly immobilized it by retiring into harbor at Ephesus and waiting. The arrival of Hannibal from Phoenician waters would enable the combined fleets to fight the Romans with the certainty of success and to hold the straits. But Hannibal was held back by the wind. Rhodes had time to recall and concentrate her ships. Cruising off the Pamphylian shore, on the watch, the Rhodians at last heard that Hannibal was at Side. He was in force, having 37 battleships, including 3 7 and 4 8 bankers, as well as 10 cruising 3 bankers, 47 ships in all. Against this, the Rhodians had only 32 4 bankers and 4 3 bankers, and their crews had a long sick list. Coming up in column of sail, the Rhodians unexpectedly ran into the Phoenician fleet as it rounded the point of Side. Hannibal, leading the van, was bringing his ships into line of battle, standing away from shore so that his rear ships would take the position nearest the land. Into this situation the Rhodians fell unprepared. The Rhodian admiral, Eudemus, leading the column, at once turned to starboard, out to sea, signaling the following ships to turn likewise as they came up, and take their places in the line. He went so fast, and took up his own position so quickly, that a serious gap was left. The battle opened by the engagement of Eudemus and 5 ships, with Hannibal's wing. Then came a long line of unengaged Phoenician ships, and all the Rhodians were crowded close to land, opposite the Venetian right wing. They soon began to take their correct positions, each turning and sailing out after Eudemus. But the temporary crowding of the Rhodians on the landward wing had an expected consequence. Assailed by an overwhelming force of Greek rams, the Phoenician wing was shattered. An immense moral impression was created at the outset by a smaller Rhodian ship at one stroke ramming and sinking a Phoenician seven-banker. Eudemus, hard-pressed and signaling for help, was soon rescued by the approach of his victorious left wing. Hannibal had no alternative but to break off the engagement. The Rhodians did not pursue. Their sick crews were exhausted. They stopped for lunch. Eudemus, at any rate, appreciated what had happened, for during the interval he called up from his conning tower to his ship's company, "Up and look at a wonderful sight." They crowded forward and saw the huge Phoenician galleys towing off their crippled companions. So Hannibal never reached the Aegean. 15. The failure of Hannibal to effect a junction with the fleet at Ephesus compelled the latter to fight at a disadvantage. At the Battle of Myonosus, the Romans captured or sank 42 ships and established their supremacy in the Greek seas. The route for Publius Scipio across the straits was open. Antiochus lost his head after the Battle of Myonosus and the failure of his land operations. Not only did he withdraw his main army south to Ephesus, but he evacuated the great fortress of Lysimachia on the straits. Publius was even more pleased at this than at the naval victory. The immense supplies abandoned in Lysimachia were very acceptable to the Roman army, and Eumenes of Pergamus had made every necessary preparation for the crossing, which was a triumphal procession instead of the desperate struggle anticipated. Overtures to Scipio were rejected. The terms laid down by Publius were impossible for the king to accept, but their very enormity was intimidating. The demand was made that Antiochus should evacuate Asia Minor and retire beyond the Taurus. The mere suggestion seemed to threaten that he would be compelled to do so. The battle was fought at Magnesia on the Hermus, northeast of Smyrna, in the autumn of the year. Publius did not condescend to honor the harmless festivity with his presence. He was indisposed and resting, while Hannibal, we may guess, down in Pamphylia, was repacking his bullion and consulting the list of possible employers who might consider the application of a military expert with capital to put into the business. Quite inferior people fought the Battle of Magnesia. When it was over, Antiochus sent envoys instructed to accept any terms offered. Publius, in his lordly way, replied that they were the same as before. So Antiochus paid the expenses of the war and departed over Taurus, on his way to disappear from history. 16. 2 years later, the Roman armies and fleets had withdrawn from Asia and left the country to its own independent governments, which became, on various terms, allies and connections of the Roman state. The hegemony so established became by degrees a government continually increasing in its effective control. The Battle of Magnesia gave Rome the dominion of the eastern Mediterranean, as that of Zama had given her the dominion of the western. The life's work of Hannibal was over. He had created the Roman Empire, and through Publius Scipio, whom he had evoked into being, he had created the Roman emperors. 17. The wizard, after Magnesia, hardly waited for the news that his own surrender was included in the peace terms. Long before anyone could give effect to so difficult a provision, his ship was hull down on the horizon of the Pamphylian Sea. End of Chapter 12, Antiochus Megas and the Struggle in Asia. Read by Mark Harrington, Framingham, Massachusetts. Chapter 13 of Hannibal by George Philip Baker. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Last news about Hannibal. 1. Hannibal tarried at Gortyna in Crete on the southern slopes of Mount Ida until he could find some definite work to do. Crete, once the home of Minos and the center of his power, was in these days as wild a nest of corsairs as the keys of Yucatan became in later times, and the fate was a strange one which sent the last great Suffete of Carthage into such company. The Phoenicians had seen the glory and fall of Minos, and now they were following him into the shadows. But Gortyna had its own disadvantages. Hannibal's bullion did not long remain a secret. It attracted the hungry interest of gentlemen among whom the 10th commandment was yet unrevealed religion. Not the least famous of the ruses which legend attributed to the wizard was the story of how he filled many pots with lead, salting them with a little gold and silver on the top, and officially depositing them for safety in the temple at Gortyna. The city warmly welcomed the deposit as a guarantee of good faith, and the strict guard it kept over Hannibal's imaginary treasure, so strict that he might have found some difficulty himself in penetrating it, was unspoiled by any knowledge that the real bullion was contained in the cargo of brass images which lay carelessly stacked on a piece of wasteland near his house. Apparently, there was little demand in Gortyna for Phoenician brass images, for no interest was taken in them. At last, he got into touch with King Prusias of Bithynia and entered his service. The scene when the Gortynians solemnly confiscated his deposit has not, unfortunately, been recorded for the sympathy of later ages. For some years, he remained the military advisor of Prusias and conducted his campaigns against Eumenes of Pergamus. Prusias himself was a man without very great brains or courage or resource, and such an assistant as Hannibal was invaluable to him alike in war and in diplomacy. Hannibal's presence in Bithynia seems to have been unknown among the senatorial party in Rome, though in other quarters, probably the Scipionic circle, many persons were aware of it and deliberately refrained from taking any steps to harry a man who was now growing old and who was no longer a serious menace to Rome. The cosmopolitan autocrats remained a loyal little party to the last. The Senate, in due course, intervened to remove the causes of friction between Prusias and Eumenes. It was one of Prusias's envoys at Rome who, at dinner with Titus Flamininus, let the cat out of the bag. Titus reported to the Senate his information that Hannibal was in Bithynia, and as this fact might explain much, he was authorized to demand Hannibal's surrender. Without venturing to defy the Senate, Prusias protested against being asked to break the law of hospitality. If the Romans wanted Hannibal, he suggested that they had better take him themselves. 2. Thus, 7 years after the Battle of Magnesia, the event came which Hannibal had long foreseen and provided against. He was at Libissa, on the shores of that long inlet which runs up from the Propontis to Nicomedia. A servant, watching from the gate, reported that unaccountable armed men were visible. Hannibal at once sent him to survey the other approaches. All were picketed. Sure now that the strangers were no accident, and that every avenue of escape was closed, he drank the draught that he habitually kept ready against emergency. This, he said, will save the Romans from the worry of waiting for the death of an old and hated man. But Titus Flamininus is not a worthy descendant of the men who warned Pyrrhus against the poison prepared for him. So, as if he had opened a door and walked out of the world, went Hannibal. Public opinion in Rome was divided. There were not wanting those who regretted his end. He was in his 65th year. Publius Scipio died the same year, at the age of 53. The man and his shadow disappeared together. Cato and the purists had demanded the account books of the Asiatic campaign. Publius deliberately tore them up before a crowded forum and left an ungrateful city which pretended to care more about methods than about results. But the leaven worked. He was the first of a succession of mighty individualists who thought more of results than of methods. 3. As if he had opened a door and walked out of the world, whether to silent and eternal dissolution, or whether to the judgment of God, still we, ignorant of what that judgment may be, have for our own sakes to reckon him up and estimate the man. Was he a meteor flitting across the night of human history without purpose or meaning? Or one of those powerful luminaries which run in definite orbits and exercise a definite influence? Not without cause, men have lingered with interest over the story of Hannibal. He both fascinates our interest and puzzles our understanding. That he was a very great man we can see, but what else was he? What was his meaning? As a private individual, there is singularly little that we can bring against his character. As far as we can judge from the reports that have come down to us, he was a quiet, well-living man of perfect integrity, who hardly ever lost his temper, who never, apparently, got drunk, and whose attitude towards women astonished his contemporaries. Whensoever he is depicted speaking, his enemies put acute and often epigrammatic good sense into his mouth. We hear of him wholly from his foes, and we hear little evil of him. There cannot be many men of whom we could say as much. The two charges brought against him by the Romans were those brought generally against Carthaginians as a people: cruelty and love of money. The latter might be no more than the surprise of men, still predominantly landowning and agricultural, at the customs of a community much more developed in financial and commercial organization. But it comes through Polybius, a Greek, who was no stranger to the ways of a commercial people, and it is the accusation which is still brought against those close kinsmen of the Phoenicians, the Jews. Polybius discussed the point with Carthaginians and with old Massinissa, who gave him his own views on the subject of Phoenicians and money. We can gather that they were interesting and vivid. Money was the only form of wealth that can have had much meaning for Hannibal. We need not doubt that he was careful with it, and that he expected fractional sums to be accounted for. No anecdotes of his careless generosity have survived. That he was honest we may infer from his financial reforms at Carthage, when it might have paid him better to share in the spoils. He seems to have owned land in the province of Byzactium, but he can scarcely have taken much interest in it. We cannot quite imagine him as a country squire. He was cut off by a great gulf from the world of men like Fabius, whose wealth and interest were in land. The charge of cruelty also is one which is made against Carthaginians as a race, and we therefore have difficulty in distinguishing the degree to which it is an accusation against Hannibal personally. There is nothing in his record similar to the ferocity with which Hamilcar suppressed the revolt of the mercenaries. Polybius, in defending him, suggests that the charge is one which arose out of the acts of his subordinates rather than out of his own personal actions. But the charge nevertheless has ground. A man who did so much damage to Italy must have ordered many things which, if we knew them in detail, would revolt us to the point of indignation. It is hardly conceivable that he had not that indifference to death and suffering which is quite consistent with a cool and even an appreciative intelligence. We may conclude that he shared with his fellow Carthaginians a considerable degree of obtuseness to these things, and that he was in his private personality a man dominated by calm and calculating reason, which might be helped but never deflected by emotional sympathy. 4. These two charges of avarice and cruelty practically exhaust the list. In neither case are they very distinctly underlined. The whole tenor of the picture drawn of him would seem to indicate that such features were rather less noticeable in him than in his countrymen. He seems hardly ever to have performed any action merely for enjoyment. The anecdotes which are told of him very seldom refer to his private actions. Most of them are stories of the sometimes playful and usually quite amiable humor which must have been a marked feature in his character as a man. The two things which survive the impersonality which surrounded him are the ingenuity of his actions as a leader and the peculiar kind of thing he used to say. He was a surprising man who, even if he could be relied upon, had a habit of realizing expectations in a totally unexpected manner. The distinctive feature of Hannibal was originality. The one thing that no man could do was to tell beforehand precisely what he would do or say. Whensoever the world guessed, it guessed wrong. This liability to guess wrong is one to which the modern critic is equally subject. We might, with good reason, think that Hannibal's intelligence was of a purely practical kind. He left not a single speculation on record, scarcely a hint of any spiritual experience. And yet this silence is not entirely satisfactory. We cannot rely upon it. The unexpected man, whose career was one unbroken sensation to his contemporaries, might have one last sensation to spring upon us. He might, in these matters, have something unexpected to say, as unexpected as the crossing of the Alps or the Battle of Cannae. Few men can have conserved their energies with more dispassionate care than Hannibal. For the main object at stake, he could take great risks, as he did when he crossed the Alps and the Apennines. But he never took a useless risk, and he never threw away any power, moral or material, that he possessed. He showed in these things all the economy of the Semite. 5. But the private personality of Hannibal is the least part of him. His importance was in his function as the representative of Semitic power in the Mediterranean and as its greatest protagonist. The day is long gone by when we could think of these vast tides of human energy as set going by private ambition or as changed by individual effort. Statesmen and soldiers are only the pilots of the ship. The waves neither rise nor are still at their bidding. Of this principle, the story of Hannibal is an illustration. If any single man could have changed the current of history, he would have changed it. But he did not change it, or, at any rate, he did not change it in the obvious way he proposed. The sense we have that Hannibal was a brilliant individualist is not deceptive. He did not trudge genially in a crowd, as Fabius did. He spent most of his life in sole and despotic command of an army which was devoted to him, and which willingly made at his request the most astonishing sacrifices. When, in later life, he had to struggle with hostile colleagues, he could not do it. He was unable to wear down hostility and shepherd the reluctant. His greatness was in the inspiration which, if labored or truncated, if not executed exactly as conceived, is useless. In this, he was a typical Phoenician, only able to put forth his full power in isolation. With a certain kind of communal life, he was never at home. His chief colleagues were his own brothers, attuned to him by family likeness and long association. He never seems to have got free from the necessity of this ready-made like-mindedness. His close and personal relationship with other men was not a bond he could artificially create by a process of discussion and accommodation. Even his relations with his army, personal and intimate as they were not produced by any such means. They were the relations of a generous and wise but exacting employer with his hands. What Hannibal could have done with an army like the Roman army is a problem over which it is interesting to speculate. The strong probability is that he could not have handled an army of fellow citizens with votes and opinions of their own. The mere necessity of adjusting his mind to theirs would have paralyzed it. He was one of those men who are good masters but bad equals. And such was the psychological history of the whole Phoenician race. What was really at issue was the type of mentality which should govern mankind. We have seen the story told. We have seen the fierceness of the struggle, the exhaustive nature of the test which tried every link to breaking point, the absoluteness of the proof. The Carthaginian power was entirely and radically destroyed, and over its dust was erected the rule of men whose power lay in mutual accommodation. The significance of Hannibal thus lies in his representative character. The Hannibalic War was a dividing line in human development. Before Hannibal, it was by no means certain that the political mode of organization would govern the future of the human race. It was still possible that human society might evolve on other lines, that common blood relationship might be a stronger bond of unity than common thought and feeling, that those who agreed in the spirit might be overcome by those who agreed in the flesh. That in fact, the only way to produce like-mindedness was to be born alike. The Hannibalic War settled this problem. It proved, by the extreme test, that a greater power and a firmer unity was forged in the Forum and the Senate than could be achieved out of the resemblances of family likeness and the dynamic energy of individual genius. 6. The interest of Hannibal cannot be made to depend entirely upon a study of his psychology. It is quite true that the hints we get from ancient historians are intensely suggestive and even provoking in making us realize what we have forever missed. If we knew as much of Hannibal as we do of Napoleon, the Carthaginian might not suffer in the comparison. But no such detailed account of Hannibal is possible. He remains a brilliant sketch. What we lose here, however, is compensated for by the greater opportunity we have for seeing him in the large. Our eyes can wander freely over the vast outlines of a whole world in which the distracting minor detail has been softened and lost, and only the important major facts are left. We can range without disturbance over the spectacle of a collision of vast forces which are perfectly visible. The interest of Hannibal, consequently, lies in his setting, the relation he bore to the world in which he lived. Not a single scandal relieves the reader from the strain of observing great events. 7. The political power which withstood and destroyed Hannibal was, as we have seen, composite. It was founded partly on an aristocratic administrative tradition and partly on a constitutional democracy. These two elements played their part in the contest. The aristocrats were the men who held Hannibal in the early days when the populares, left to themselves, would have gone under. But it was the populares who struck him down. By electing young Publius Scipio over the heads of the Senate, the assembly proved the value of that constitutional power, which at need can go outside the beaten track of customary practice. Even in this, the composite nature of the Roman political state was illustrated. Though the assembly elected the commander who ended the war, that commander was in his private person an aristocrat. Where the plebeian Varro failed, the patrician Scipio succeeded. The superiority of the Roman political system over the Greek is emphasized when we compare the stories of Dionysius and Agathocles with that of Scipio Africanus. The latter needed no formal dictatorship, nor required for his effective functioning to subvert the constitution. Battered as Rome was, she emerged intact from the long contest, recognizably the same in character and system. This alone was enough to exalt the Roman state beyond all its rivals. A constitution which could survive a test which had destroyed all others was clearly a force to which all others must conform. And this was the actual result. The Roman system drove its competitors out of the field. Of them, little survives. The subsequent development of humanity was on the model which Rome provided. We may draw some deductions from the different parts borne in the war by the various elements in the composite Roman state. The experience of Carthage also casts a sidelight on the whole problem with which the world was struggling. In the series of steps by which the process of unification was carried out in the Mediterranean, practically all the powers were groping for something they had not got, a creative function within the state which could guide their action. They were all conscious, in varying ways, of the difficulty that their action was blind, or at any rate was carried out by elements more or less amateur and unspecialized for the task. The Greeks and Carthaginians, in turn, had recourse to dictatorship in the hope of finding in that expedient a specialized creative political function capable of carrying out the changes necessary. But Rome faced the Carthaginians with a political arrangement which was destined to be the true solution. In the Hannibalic War, we see it in germ in this difference between the parts played by the aristocratic and the popular parties. The former we will consider in a moment, but the latter needs all the more emphasis because it was a crude beginning, needing to pass through a whole series of transformations before it assumed its final shape. The relations between Scipio and the assembly were the beginnings of a new political institution. Without overriding the normal processes of the state, he established an unofficial link with the assembly, which was the first step towards personal government. The future of this relation was conditioned by its beginning. It was from the first based upon the support of the electors. It was not a dictatorship like that of Dionysius. It was not external to the state, like the position of Hannibal. It was not a tribal monarchy, like that of Alexander. It had not, and never acquired, the nature of the monarchy possessed by Antiochus. Dictatorship, as a normal function, was fading out of Roman practice precisely at the moment when Scipio introduced the new idea. From these relations of Scipio and the assembly sprang ultimately the creative office which carried Mediterranean civilization to its due consummation. Its pedigree is clear. Necessity invented Hamilcar, and Hamilcar begat Hannibal, and Hannibal provoked Scipio, and Scipio suggested Sulla, and Sulla created Caesar, and Caesar trained Augustus, and from Augustus sprang the Principate, and from the Principate the later Roman and North European monarchies, which founded the modern world. This personal government, depending first upon an assembly, then upon a military guild, and later upon a curia, court, or, in its latest form, a body of tenants-in-chief, was radically different from earlier monarchy, and bore from beginning to end the stamp of its origin. It was the creative office which the political state specialized to meet the needs of its evolution. 8. The failure of the Greek and Carthaginian methods was due to the fault that they overrode instead of supplementing the normal processes of a political state. The difficulty was to arise again later in circumstances not necessary here to detail. Against this, the Roman Senate formed a strong barrier. The old aristocratic element in the Senate was the active force in molding opinion and determining policy. From their ranks came most of the successful commanders and statesmen, and they were resolute from the first in conciliating, in persuading, in guiding, and even in tricking public feeling into the preservation of the normal political action of the state. If, therefore, the aristocratic party exercised none of the extraordinary functions which are performed by traveling outside the beaten track, it rendered them possible by acting as a kind of gyroscope, continually restabilizing the state as the balance of forces changed. For the most part, we are in the habit of picturing to ourselves a violent contrast between the idea of discussion and mutual agreement and the idea of aristocracy. The one, we think, is democratic. The other, built up of irresponsible command and servile obedience. We think of aristocracy as the contradiction of the political state. But this view is not borne out by the facts. Discussion and agreement are often the last things that a crowd of men can manage. What it can easily achieve is common action under a collective emotion, and this is so far from being discussion and agreement that it is often their polar opposite. Among the most alarming things in life is a crowd under the influence of an unreasoning collective emotion. One of the aims of a statesman is to break up the crowd, to prevent it from acting under collective emotion, and to get it to reason, and to reach a like-mindedness born not of sympathetic feeling, but of rational agreement. This was the function of the Roman Senate under the leadership of Quintus Fabius. Again and again, the Senate was called upon to get things away from the sphere of enthusiastic emotion into the sphere of cold reason. We do not see old Fabius telling the people to eat grass, nor haughtily issuing commands to the lower classes. We see him smiling steadily, arguing patiently, and we see him getting his way by an enormous patience and a monumental good sense. Yet, if any man was an aristocrat, in the narrowest sense of the word, that man was Fabius. Aristocracy is as much a political institution as democracy is. The notion of an aristocrat as a man who issues arrogant commands is a tradition of barbarism, not of civilization. 9. The modern world has tended partly to lose altogether the remembrance of what aristocracy is, and partly to think that the particular kind of aristocracy it chances to know is the only kind there is, or ever was. But within its own limits, aristocracy is susceptible of immense variety, for it is a political function rather than a type of character. An aristocracy is a body of men who can act as a common denominator in a state composed of differentiated and specialized types. And a race might, in the human sense, continue to be great and even increase in the distinction of the character it produces, and yet cease to be an aristocracy because it has ceased to command the common allegiance of other types of men. But the type of character that is embodied in any aristocracy is nevertheless interesting and illuminating. The characters of Fabius and Scipio are essential elements in the story of Hannibal. We can, of course, reduce that story to the brief formula that Hannibal was a man of genius who was overwhelmed by the mass of the commonplace men against whom he fought. But men of genius are not overwhelmed by the mass of the commonplace. They circumvent it and dissolve it. It is because of this power that they are men of genius. What a man of genius cannot rely upon doing is to defeat men with another kind of genius. Rome produced two men of genius to counter Hannibal. One, Quintus Fabius, was a great man of the aristocratic type. The other, Publius Scipio, was a great man of the autocratic or monarchical type. Both were men very peculiarly and especially adapted to the processes of a political state. As simple individuals, neither of them could compare with Hannibal. As living parts in the political machine, they were capable of collecting and transmitting forces that destroyed him. 10. The men who directly profited by the fall of Carthage were the wealthy plebeians, the bankers and commercial men who were the controlling power of the assembly and the popular party. At the old landed interest throughout Italy, the war struck a deadly blow from which it never recovered. The change in the political balance was no doubt not immediate. Cato shows us the bridge over. That remarkable man, as he grew older, developed a character which made him the embodiment of the Roman tradition, as it was fixed and perpetuated by the war. Himself a plebeian, with most of the instincts of the reformer and the Puritan, he added to his natural qualities those which he imperfectly learned from a passionate admiration for the aristocratic party led by Quintus Fabius. The blend had some immortal characteristics. It was unbending, incorruptible, and consistent to the point of meticulousness. It sought, even if it did not achieve, some central ground of realism where expedience was not judged merely by the feelings. The result, curious in its way, gave shape and perpetuity to a mood of transition which might otherwise have perished. Since he sought to deal with social problems without shirking their moral difficulty, his attitude led him to solutions which were consistent at the expense of their human feeling. He was traditionally made responsible for the destruction of Carthage. Not all Romans agreed with that policy. Its chief opponent was a Scipio. But there was no longer a direct descendant of Publius Scipio Africanus to witness it. Fate had a stranger irony in store when she brought it about that Scipio Aemilianus, the great-grandson of the consul who fell at Cannae, should superintend that tragedy. On the awful day when Hasdrubal's wife, the embodied spirit of Semitic Carthage, after denouncing her cowardly husband, had hurled her children into the flames. When the Roman labor corps was raking the fiery ashes and tangled ruins out of the path of the legionaries. When the last Carthaginians were dying, as the last Romans would have died in the capital had Hannibal reached it. Scipio Aemilianus seized Polybius by the hand and spoke immortal words of fear lest this nightmare should return to haunt the deathbed of Rome. But it had other effects. It placed the Roman in the shoes of the Carthaginian. It made him the heir of the financial and commercial supremacy of Carthage, and he took over the liabilities as well as the assets of his predecessor. 11. The change weakened the moral foundation of the Roman state, as the Romans themselves believed. It was by no desire of theirs that power slipped into the hands of a moneyed instead of a landed class, and transformed Roman civilization more into the likeness of the Carthaginian civilization it had destroyed. But the process was inevitable, because even apart from other causes, it was impossible that the influence of the landholders of central Italy could permanently retain its power in an expanding state. The conquest of Carthage and the acquisition of the East altered the proportion of things. The commercial interests could extend their activity over the whole Mediterranean world, but the landholders could not extend in the same way. The war, by weakening the landed interests, very possibly cut out of Roman history the political struggle that might have occurred between the two classes had this development been more gradual. When, half a century later, the small farmers did revolt against the moneyed men, many of the old aristocratic families sympathized and even shared the struggle, but the latter were already broken as a compact force and could contribute nothing but individual leadership and assistance. The growth of the moneyed power was thus not a tragic accident, but a natural stage in the evolution of the Roman state, growing direct out of the necessities and conditions of its development. Rome did suffer from the diminution of that stabilizing force which the old aristocratic influence represented. The age of the civil wars betrays unmistakably that some saving function had failed within the state. It is impossible to conceive such men as Fabius sharing in the rage of civil strife which convulsed the Italy of later generations and deluged Rome itself with blood. But if it were not a tragic accident, it was a tragic necessity. At intervals, men reasonably stand aghast at the conditions of their own progress. It seems to be built up on blood and contest. It seems to be achieved by sacrificing what was already gained. The ultimate result may make the intermediate difficulties worth enduring. But to justify the means, the end must be singularly splendid. The instinctive belief of mankind is generally that it will be so, and this belief has to be taken into account. 12. Another factor also had a share in the growth of the moneyed power. While a landed aristocracy starts in the political race with an advantage over other classes, inasmuch as the very exercise of its function teaches it the rules of government, it is seldom or never the originator of creative ideas concerning the use of wealth. In every civilization, however, there is a stage at which the question of the utilization of wealth becomes the dominant problem. And it is this stage which gives commercial oligarchy a significance all its own. The Roman aristocracy, in its prime, never had any particular gift for consuming. It had no art, no literature, and no luxury. We should err if we thought that it had therefore no brains. It had singularly acute and profound powers of thinking. It hoed its turnips while meditating upon the mysteries of law. Its meditations on this head have outlasted the Colosseum and the mausoleum of Augustus. But jurisprudence, after all, is nothing but a system of relationships. The things it relates are the concrete actualities, and the old Roman aristocracy, good as it was at the establishment of relations, never showed much gift for producing things to be related. Left to its aristocratic inventors, life would have remained about as interesting as a volume of Euclid. It was the commercial man, the stout plutocrat, who clothed the abstract relations with the vulgar gorgeousness of material well-being. The plutocrat walked in purple and fine linen, to the indignation of the aristocrat and the fury of Cato, and handed out the endowments to the artists and the literary men who gave the tale of his vices and weaknesses a long life, and his gifts a short one. The expansion of the commercial and financial interests of Rome was thus marked by an influx of culture and luxury, which were alien to the old aristocratic tradition. Scipio and his circle were the first to adopt the new fashion, a fact which is not without its significance. 13. To defeat a man is to become like him. There is some recondite law of the human mind which forces the critic to do the thing he criticizes, and this perhaps explains why men, when they have fought to the death to destroy some hated thing, insensibly begin to take on its color and assume its vesture. The defeat of Hannibal and the destruction of Carthage had this effect. For good and evil, the spirit of Hannibal haunted Rome. For good and evil, the moral atmosphere of the great African mart accompanied Rome on her march through time. The curled and bewhiskered seamen were still lounging the quays of the Mediterranean when Columbus signed on his cruise. The Phoenician vocabulary and phonetics, it is said, were long traceable in Africa and Spain. However that may be, the very visage and mentality of the Phoenician lingered on, and when Cortez and Pizarro had hewed out new conquests in lands of which Carthage had never heard, the swarthy, gold-ringed man, with his touch of Tyrian purple, was among the foremost of the human eagles who gathered to explore and exploit. End of chapter 13. Last news about Hannibal. Read by Mark Harrington, Framingham, Massachusetts. End of Hannibal by George Philip Baker.